You see, the fear of God is one side, but if you can understand who God is and trust Him and fear Him appropriately, then you also have safety in God. The reason that we fear God is because He's God, because He's our Creator, and because He has the power and the right to discipline, to judge, and to bring calamity if we ignore Him. But He also has the ability to discipline, to judge, and to bring calamity to the thing that's against us. So the fact that my God is powerful doesn't scare me, because He's not coming for me. He's coming for my enemies. So there's two sides. So when we remove the fear of God, and when we say, don't fear God, just respect God. Don't fear His judgment, just respect Him. We're losing the value of who God is. So we're going to get into the kings of Israel this morning, lesson number 5. And as you can tell, I am excited about getting started. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the beauty and all that we see outside. Thank you that you are with us, that you love us. Lord, I pray you'd open the word to us this morning and help us to see your beautiful face in it. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Last week, we saw the conflict with the Philistines that had come to a head. And Jonathan and a small band of men attacked the Philistine garrison and started a conflict that Saul is going to have to manage. This week, Saul calls all the people together at Gilgal to wait for Samuel to make a sacrifice so that they can go to war with God's blessing. So we're going to start right here in Gilgal, which is down on the coast, and we're going to see the cost of sin. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8. We're going to get a running start from last week. It says he's talking of Saul, and he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offerings. So we see here, if you see the overall map, Gibeah is where they started. If you see down here, this is in Benjamin. You see Jerusalem, so it's just north of Jerusalem. And then over here is Gilgal, which is where most of the stuff today is going to take place. There's Jericho. A few weeks ago, our lesson was out here. So this is where we're at in 13:10. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of the offering, the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. So just as Saul finishes up these two offerings to God, Samuel comes down and greets Saul. Verse 11, and Samuel said, "What hast thou done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves at Michmash." So he says, I didn't want to do this, Samuel, but I didn't have a choice. I saw that the people were getting scattered, so I decided to do this. And therefore I said, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered burnt offerings. So Saul says, I didn't want to, Samuel. I had to. I had no choice. We're down here in the valley. We're down here in Gilgal. All the Philistines in the world are gathered up at Michmash above us. We see all their chariots and all this. And he says, Samuel, I didn't have a choice. I had to do it this way. But let's look at what Saul did. And when I started this lesson, I said the reason that we're going to study this is because we've forgotten the fear of God in our own lives. We've forgotten what it looks like to fear God. And it's been that way for every generation, and it's the same problem they had. Well, the first problem that he faced is the people are leaving. They're not going to, the resources that I need are playing out of my hands. I'm running out of money, I'm running out of time, I'm running out of help. Whatever the resource is, he says, the people are leaving, I'm losing the resource. And then he says, the Philistines are on the hill, they're waiting to come down. So the problems are coming, they're not stopping, and the people are leaving. The resources needed to deal with the problems are going away. Now, every family has faced this at some point. At some point, every family has come to the place where we have this thing to do, and we don't have the resources to do it. God has given us this this opportunity to raise these kids, and we don't have the resources for what's next. So it's a very common thing. And so then Saul sits back and he looks at the problems and he looks at the resources and he puts his mind to it and he comes to this plan. I am going to accomplish God's work by disobeying God's word. And this is an extremely common. We look at the kings and we go, how could Saul be so dumb? And yet we do the same thing. We get to a situation and we're like, I need to get this done, and to do that, I have to do this. And okay, it violates God's word a little bit, but I need it to get done. We do this in churches all the time. But he's wrong. Disobeying God's word is never the way to get God's work done. God will never ask you to accomplish something that will violate his word. He'll always accomplish things when we are in obedience. Trusting God and not flesh is the best way to get something done that we're called to do. If we can rest in God and rest in his work, which is what Saul should have done, if we can do that, then God will show up and complete in our lives what we couldn't complete for ourselves. But because he decided to trust the flesh instead of trusting God's word, he was rejected. Now, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, Paul's talking about this very thing. He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. So Paul has laid out a thought. And in his thought, he starts with this idea that if you are godly and content with what you have, there's great gain in that. Now he's going to go back and he's going to prove that. He says, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. Having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. So Paul says, when you say, I need to, you don't really need to. Understand that if you have food and raiment, that's enough. He's not saying don't have more than food and raiment, but understand that that's enough, and instead focus on godliness. Continuing on verse 9, but they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare. So he says, if your desire is not to godliness, but your desire is to riches, then you're falling into a snare. It's not a matter of where you're at, it's a matter of your focus. It's not a matter of how much wealth you have. It's a matter of what is the desire behind your actions, your driving point. Saul's desire here that we see as he's gathered in Gilgal is to defeat the Philistines. It was the wrong plan. It was the wrong focus. Saul's desire should have been to be obedient to God, to do what God asked. And if that had been his desire, his point, if that was where he was coming from, then he wouldn't have said, I had to offer these sacrifices, because the reason that he offered the sacrifices was so that he could win, not so that he could be obedient. So he says, if you will be rich, if that's the intent, the focus, you're falling into a snare and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. This is important. God's design is not that you be without, it's that you don't drown in destruction and perdition. In other words, if you seek to gather an accomplishment that's outside of God's will, the thing that you're seeking will be your demise. It will be the thing that hurts you. And so God says, I want to direct you here and now, follow me. He says, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. You see, God isn't trying to keep us from the good things that he has for us. Rather, he desires to give us those good things. If Saul had stopped trying to beat the Philistines and started trying to follow God, then God would beat the Philistines. We'll see that in a little while. Paul's saying, I don't have the resources. I've only got 600 men. And I can't beat all these Philistines. He was right. But 600 men in an earthquake can. So stop trying to beat the Philistines and start trying to obey God. Now we're going to look at something that is a foundation here is laid in the Old Testament that we're going to get to in the New Testament. So we're going to look at this foundation, time. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly, and hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. So Samuel says to Saul, he says, Saul, what you did stopped God from establishing your kingdom forever. Now, if you look back, and I don't have time to do it, but if we look back in Genesis chapter 49, God says of Benjamin, he says, you're going to be raving wolves, Benjamin. You're going to be raving wolves that will bring destruction wherever you go. And of Judah, he says, Judah will, the scepter will not depart from your house, and the lawgiver from Judah. So Judah is going to be the king of Israel already all the way back in the book of Genesis. But here we are up in Samuel, and God says to Saul, Saul, if you hadn't made this decision, I would have established your kingdom forever. Was it legitimate? Was God legitimately saying, look, I would have, but now I'm not based on your actions? Or had God decided in eternity past, no, I am not going to allow Saul to be king? So can God make a promise in Genesis and then say, I would have negated that promise? Now, here's what we know as we look through time. We know that this was the first time that Saul came to a critical juncture, and at that juncture depended on the flesh and not on the Lord. That was the first time. But all it did was expose Saul's character. Over the next many years that we see Saul, and then it'll be, I think it says in Acts, he ruled for 40 years. So over the next 30 years or so, 35 years, we're going to see Saul act in one way after the other that walks further and further from God. He will continue to move toward following the flesh instead of following God, so that each time he comes to a circumstance that's difficult, he will choose to follow what he sees. God knew that, and God said, based on your actions, I'm removing the kingdom from you. But let's keep going. Verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. So he says to Saul, he says, Saul, because of what you did, because you acted against me, then I am going to not let you be king the way that I would have. But here's where it gets interesting. If we look at these passages, the Lord hath sought. Let me highlight them here. The Lord hath sought. That is a perfect participle. So there's two verbs there. Hath, which would be what we'd use as had. Sought, our past tense of seek, right? So this is a past perfect participle that he's using to having already sought out some other king. And then he says he found this man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded. Again, this is a past tense. In other words, God already has done this. So God, he says to Saul, Saul, I have seen your actions now, and because of the way you've acted, I have gone out and I've found another man that's a man after my own heart, and I've commanded him to be captain over my people. There's a small difficulty with this. David isn't born yet. David doesn't get anointed until, chapter 15 or 16? And yet, from God's perspective, God says, not only have I picked him out, I've already told him he's going to be king. Now, how can God say, in Genesis, I'm going to appoint Judah king, and then in Samuel, I would have chosen you, Saul, but since you sinned, I've already chosen, talked to, and appointed somebody else. Now, I've got something that'll make this a lot simpler. This one sentence. What will happen to you in the past someday? Doesn't that clear it up? You see, God doesn't exist in time. God doesn't exist in space. Time is a measurement that we use for energy, for things to pass from now until tomorrow. If we look at God as having, being able to travel through time and take power over time, we're completely missing the point of being all-powerful. You see, it's not that God's powerful enough to overcome time and see into the future. God isn't part of time. Time has no stricture on God at all. He's not overcoming time. He doesn't dwell in time. When God created man, created heaven and earth, and he spoke the world into existence, he was also walking with me at 4 or 5 years old. He was with me as I am now and as an old man. He was talking to Abraham. When God acts, he acts in the present tense at all times. So much so that when he's describing himself, he describes himself as I am. I'm present. So were you? Yes. Will you be? Yes. Are you now? Yes. Now in all tenses, in all places, at all times. So God can write my name in a book before the foundation of the world and know every thought that I'm going to think and have paid for me, and I can be sitting with him in glory all at the same time from God's perspective. But from my perspective, I'm going to walk through it. Now, this is something that we see throughout the Scripture, and when we pass it, I just wanted to point it out. So let's look at Romans 8:29, and it's talking about us. It says, "For whom he did foreknow," that's me, "from the foundation of the world, God knew that I would be his son. He did also predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son." So him knowing me from the beginning decided that I would be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. So you see, this is also a participle that's a past participle, called. In other words, he called me in the past. Now, when Paul is writing this, I hadn't been born yet, right? Because this is, 60 A.D. So when Paul's writing this, I hadn't been born yet, but I had already been called. I had already been predestinated. I had already had my name written in a book. He says, "And whom he called, them he also justified," past tense. So before I was born, I was justified in God's time frame, not in my own. "And whom he justified, them he also glorified." Now I know from 1 Corinthians 15 that I will be glorified when he comes back and I get a glorified body. That's when I will actually have finished the process that he started on Calvary in my life, that I will be born again or be changed in a moment and have a brand new body. But he says in God's eyes, that's already taken place. In God's eyes, I'm seated in heaven at the table having supper with him right now because he is always. It's an interesting point, but it's more than an interesting point. It corresponds back to the fear of God. God knows what you're going to choose, but you have to choose it. And when you choose it, he'll act in accordance with what you've chosen. But he already knows what you'll choose. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15, "And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin." So he went up the ridge. "And Saul numbered the people that were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son, and the people that were present with them, abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash." So here we have Saul going back up the ridge, and he counted everybody, and they've got 600 people. "And spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. And one company turned into the way that leadeth unto Ophrah, and unto the land of Shual. And another company turned the way to Beth-oren. And another company turned the way of the border that looked unto the valley of Zeboam, toward the wilderness." So here we have this, if you can see the center there, Gilgal, out here on this edge, is where Saul offered that sacrifice. And Abijah is where the Philistines have come from, or where they'll chase them back to in a minute. And Gibeah right here is where they're encamped right now, and they're watching the Philistines up here at Michmash. Now, if we zoom in on it, and we see that the Philistines from Michmash, which is a high point, so they can see a long ways, they've gone and started spoiling the land in 3 directions. So they break off 3 companies out of their big, and the reason is because the Israelites are all hiding in caves and dens and hiding from the Philistines. So they said, we got to draw them out. So let's go wreck their farms and tear up their stuff and kill their animals and generally terrorize the land until the Israelites are broken before us. And so here in Gibeah sits Saul with his 600 men trembling, watching the Philistines do this without being able to do much about it. Now verse 19, this shows the disposition of the troops. It says, "Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel." Remember last week I said that Israel recognized that they were under Philistine control. The Philistines owned the land. "For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears." So they didn't allow them to have armorers. "But all of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share and his culture and his axe and his mattock." So he's telling us, so the Philistines lived on the coast. That's why it says go down. So they're up here in the hill country where it was rough, and the Philistines lived in Gaza down at the lowland on the coast. And if you wanted to make an axe to chop wood, you would go down to a Philistine smith, because the Philistines didn't allow them to have things like forges and iron stockpiles and anvils, and if they caught you with a hammer and making something, then they would kill you. And if you want a plowshare, if you want something to cut the ground or trees with, then you had to go to the Philistines to get that thing. So they are an unarmed civilization. Verse 21, yet they had a file for the mattocks and for the coulters and for the forks and for the axes and to sharpen the goads. So he says for their general farm work, they were allowed to have a file to do the sharpening, but if they broke the thing, they had to take it to the Philistines to fix it. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. But with Saul and with Jonathan his son there was found. So there were 2 swords among the Israelites. Now, if you recall, there's something like 30,000 chariots, 300,000 soldiers, something like that amongst the Philistines. There are 2 guys with swords amongst the Hebrews. You can see why Saul is nervous, right? This is not a winnable fight. They're going to have, there's no way they can win. So continuing on verse 23. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. Now we'll look at that passage here in a minute. So let's jump into chapter 14. 14:1. Now it came to pass upon the day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison. That is on the other side. But he told not his father. Now, if you look at all the actions Saul takes and all the actions Jonathan takes, Saul's actions make some sense, and Jonathan's are absolutely senseless. In military academies in history today, they actually study Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was the first guy with the hammer and anvil, where you have a immobile force with fortifications and a fast-moving cavalry that shoves them into it, and you can win at great odds. So we still look at Alexander the Great's military prowess. Nobody looks at Jonathan's military prowess. He has the worst ideas ever. And yet, we're going to see victory from Jonathan and not from Saul, because Jonathan has faith and is trusting God, and Saul is trying to do it in the flesh, even though it was incapable of doing it. So he goes on to the other side without telling his dad. That's his first decision that makes me scratch my head. So you have so few guys, and you have 2 swords, and this guy takes half of the swords and goes to scout the military that's way overly powerful. It reminds me, like, if you're on a farm, right, and you got this hornet's nest, and you have to get the hornet's nest out, and so you get out on your pickup truck, and I've got a paper bag, and I've got like one glove, and you know this is going to hurt, right? It's not going to go well, but you have to take the hornet's nest out. So you're sitting there with your paper bag and your glove, and you're trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. And about that time, your son sneaks around the front of the truck and says, I got it, Dad, and throws a rock and hits the hornet's nest for you, right? That's what Jonathan is doing for Saul at this point is he's like, hang on, Dad, I'm going to sneak over in this valley and peg this at... So it's a terrible military move. Verse 2, and Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah. So Saul's on the far side of Gibeah, under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people that were with him were about 600 men. So they're on the backside, and I'll show you a photo from the area in a minute. You can see for miles. So these armies can see each other, but they're far enough away that they can disperse down into the valleys, which is why the Philistines haven't charged them yet. They can still get away. And Ai, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of the Philistines, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod, and the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. So this lineage is Eli. If you remember, Samuel replaced Eli. And then Phinehas, Samuel's son, was a ne'er-do-well. And then his 2 grandsons are ne'er-do-wells. And so Ahijah, which is the backup priest he's the second string priest for Saul, is in the camp with Saul. So as Samuel has left, instead of Saul repenting and falling before God's mercy, he's gone to the backup priest and brought him out. And he's got on the priestly garments. And it gives you a view of Saul's set of mindset. Verse 4, And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sinneth. And the forefront one was situated northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. So here we have these two stones that are telling us where exactly Jonathan's at in this fight. So he's down in this valley right here. You see these two red arrows. Those are the stones on each side, and it's a sharp cliff face, and he's down in the middle. Well, this does something. It hems him in. So where Saul is on the backside of Gibeah, if the Philistines charge, Saul can get away. He's hemmed his bets. But Jonathan's now gone up to see, and the reason that he's down there, if you see this valley, this steep valley right here at the bottom, this is where Jonathan is making his way up. This is where the Philistines are on this high point. Saul is way back over here, and this is the pass that the Philistines have come down to. So they're gathered, if you can imagine, this whole area has got chariots, horses, tents, armies, fires, and then here comes Jonathan up this valley to go see what they're up to. If you look down in the valley, this is a modern day photo of the valley. If you can probably see the little cows down in here. So Jonathan's working his way up this valley right here, and you can see he's completely hemmed in. It'd only take about 5 Philistines, 2 on each end and 1 to charge him, to take out this lad with one of Israel's only swords and his armor bearer. And Jonathan said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Now, Jonathan seems to me like more of a brash young man than a man of great faith. I don't know, but he seems like a kid that grew up reading about Gideon, right? And this is his Gideon moment. He's read about Gideon his whole life and how Gideon, took out these huge Midianite army and all the work that God did. And he is like, you know what? We're going to come up to this garrison and see, and we don't know what God will do. In other words, Jonathan's spoiling for a fight. Before he gets into the valley, before he goes to search out without telling his dad, the whole point of Jonathan running off is he's spoiling for a fight. And his armor bearer said unto him, Do all that is in thine heart, turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thine heart, according to thine heart, which is some statement of faith by the armor bearer. Verse 8, Then said Jonathan, Behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. And if they say unto us, Tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. So this is Jonathan's fleece. If you recall, Gideon put the fleece before the Lord and did it 3 different times that he sought confirmation from God. And so Jonathan says, okay, here's our confirmation. We're going to sneak up to this overwhelming force, and then we're going to come out from our hiding spot, and we're going to show ourselves to them. And if they say, come on, let's go fight, then we'll know that God is with us. Worst plan ever. It's a ridiculous plan. You're giving up your whole hiding place. You're telling them that you're there. And why wouldn't they call you up? I mean, they don't want to run down in the rocks and chase you. We're going to see he's got to climb a cliff to get to the garrison. But he comes up through the valley and he says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to jump out from behind the rocks, yell at the Philistines, and if they call us, then we're going to go up and kill them all. Good for Jonathan. But if they say thus, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. Now, in spite of all that Jonathan is doing, he got one thing right. He trusts God. He has faith in God. God's design, God's purpose, his plan in this is to deliver Israel. That was his plan to start with. And God is going to deliver Israel. And if Saul had stopped and said, Lord, I want to follow you, what would you have us do? Then God would have used Saul, but that wasn't Saul's heart. That wasn't what was in him. But Jonathan, it is. Jonathan says, we're going to follow God and trust God, and we're going to go out on a limb, and we're going to leave it all before God, and God is going to use Jonathan because it is God's design to win and beat Israel. My point is that the weakest plan with God, the most unthought out, silly plan with God, is absolutely wins the day. So they do that. They go up and they discover themselves. And both of them discovered themselves under the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they hid themselves." So they didn't take them very serious. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them into the hand of Israel." Now that is a great statement of faith. So here is two guys, one sword, at the bottom of a cliff, looking up at these, and we know that the Philistines are a lot bigger than the Israelis, right? And they're armored, and they all have weapons, and they have backup. They can call. They're just there to watch the pass. And Jonathan's looking up the cliff, and he's like, they called us. We got him now. Let's climb. And so they start climbing the cliff up to get. I just think that it's the funniest battle ever. Verse 13 here. And Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. So he gets up on top of the hill with his one sword and his young lad with a pitchfork, and there's 20 guys up there, and it says he slew after him. Like Jonathan is the superhero walking through this crowd of towering Philistines, just slaying them right and left. We see how this happens. And that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men, within, as it were, an half acre of land, which the yoke of an oxen might plow. So there's this point that they come up. There's a half acre of land on top. There's 20 guys up there to watch the pass. These two imbeciles climb up the cliff, but they believed God, and God delivered them into their hands. And so they go through. I can't help but think of the spiritual thing that's happening in the background. I imagine there's a bunch of angels snickering that the Philistines and Jonathan can't see. And the Philistine, grabs his first spear, and then, Michael just deflects the thing, and he misses. And he's like, how did I miss that? And about that time, he gets stabbed with a pitchfork, and then pretty soon 20 of them fall dead. It's a hilarious battle. Verse 15, and there was trembling in the host, in the field, and among all the people. And the garrison and the spoilers, and they also trembled in the earthquake. So it was a very great trembling. So they get up there, and they start this fight, and an earthquake hits. And the Philistines are trying to fight, but every time they try to take a step, the ground disappears, or it comes up and it smacks them. So they're falling over right and left, and the Hebrews are watching this take place. Verse 16, and the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went on beating down one another. So here is this huge army ready to fight, and the Hebrews, besides Jonathan so far, we haven't seen the Hebrews lift a hand. The Hebrews have been watching this take place without having to do anything, and now this great Philistine army, you've got horses running one way, chariots going, people are shooting their bows. What's happening? Dust comes up, there's a wind. He tries to stab him and instead sticks this guy because of the earthquake. So the Philistines, this huge army, ends up fighting each other. Now, Saul's issue was, we don't have enough guys to deal with the problem. There's a problem in front of us, and we can't deal with the problem. We don't have the resources, and because we don't have the resources, we have to step outside of the commandment of God and do our own thing. Jonathan said, we don't have any resources, and I don't need them. I'm going to climb in the worst possible way to fight somebody. I'm going to climb up a cliff to an elevated, flat position where they're set, waiting on us to attack them with 2 guys against 20, and only one of us has a sword, and yet God was with Jonathan. The point of this story, the whole reason for the recording of it and the understanding it is to trust God. You see, the fear of God is one side, but if you can understand who God is and trust Him and fear Him appropriately, then you also have safety in God. The reason that we fear God is because He's God, because He's our creator. And because he has the power and the right to discipline, to judge, and to bring calamity if we ignore him. But he also has the ability to discipline, to judge, and to bring calamity to the thing that's against us. So the fact that my God is powerful doesn't scare me, because he's not coming for me. He's coming for my enemies. So there's two sides. So when we remove the fear of God, and when we say, don't fear God, just respect God. Don't fear his judgment, just respect him. We're losing the value of who God is. When I was a kid, I had great comfort in the fact that my dad was tough, right? So if I go into a situation, Dad's got my back. I don't have to be scared. Why? Because Dad's bigger and tougher than you are. And it gives you a certainty of that. When we make God a small God that's our butler, that we call when we want stuff, but that has no teeth, no judgment, no holiness that he demands, then our enemies also have that in our mind. So by fearing God, we have peace and comfort. David wrote, he said, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Those are both things that he whacks the sheep with and that he drags the sheep with and protects the sheep. But he says, the fact that the shepherd has a rod and a staff, I find comfort in that. I find security and peace in that because God will protect me. Now I'm going to stop here because I'm coming up to the end, and I don't want to get into the next section and not be able to finish it. So next week we're going to look at Saul's stupid vow. And it's important not to make stupid vows. We see this in Judges too. It's important not to make stupid vows. So we'll get into that next week. Isn't that a hilarious story? Jonathan, can you imagine these two kids climbing up a cliff, certain they're going to beat 20 guys? If God be for us, who can be against us, right? Trust the Lord. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this word. Thank you for what you're doing in our lives. Help us to trust you better. Help us to walk with you nearer. Help us to fear you the way that you should be so that we have confidence and certainty in every situation that we come to. Thank you for being our God, and thank you for being our friend, for caring for us. Lord, I pray that you would just direct us according to your will. We want to follow your path, Lord, in our lives, our families, our church, and our country. We want to follow your path and not our own. Help us to lean on you and not our own understanding. Thank you for what you've done and will do. In Jesus' precious name, amen.